Antony Blinken is back in the Middle East.
It is time for it to get done. It's also time to make sure that no one takes any steps that could derail this process.
And Kyiv orders evacuations ahead of Russian advances.
In 2 weeks, Russian forces might be getting control over the city of Pokrovsk if nothing changes and if the pace of the assault remain on the same level.
Plus, Democrats and demonstrators head to Chicago, the blame game in the South China Sea, and talks to end the civil war in Sudan. Today is Monday, August 19th, and this is VOA's Flashpoint. Good evening. I'm Lori London in Washington.
And I'm Steve Karish. We begin in the Middle East. Speaking with reporters in Tel Aviv on Monday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that this is a decisive moment and that the latest Gaza ceasefire deal could be the last chance to secure the return of hostages and end the fighting between Hamas and Israel.
It is time for it to get done. It's also time to make sure that no one takes any steps that could derail this process. And so we're working to make sure that there is no escalation, that there are no provocations, that there are no actions that in any way could move us away from getting this deal over the line, or, for that matter, escalating the conflict to other places and to greater intensity.
There has been increased urgency to reach that deal amid fears of the war escalating across the region. Iran has threatened to retaliate against Israel after the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran on July 31st. It's an accusation that Israel will neither confirm nor deny. But even as hopes for a ceasefire are high, implementing it could prove challenging, analysts say. VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias has the details.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in the Middle East in a renewed push to secure a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. The end of hostilities would be carried out in 3 phases, explains national security professor at the University of New Haven, Howard Stauffer. He spoke via Skype.
And the withdrawal process, even from Gaza, is complicated because Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has said that they want a restriction on armed individuals in southern Gaza from going into northern Gaza.
The implementation could prove tricky, Stauffer notes.
There may be differences of opinion about who may be released, and the withdrawal process, even from Gaza, is complicated because Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has said that they want a restriction on armed individuals in southern Gaza from going into northern Gaza.
Blinken's visit comes amid heightened tensions. Iran could still avenge the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh last month in Tehran. Successful peace talks could calm the mood.
Then there's a very strong likelihood that Hezbollah on its own, or Iran and Hezbollah, will carry out their retaliatory strikes against Israel. If they do that, there will be a much greater widening of the war in the entire region.
The end of the hostilities would ensure the distribution of humanitarian aid in Gaza and allow for mass vaccinations against the rising threat of polio. The Palestinian health minister confirmed the first case Saturday. Some Palestinian mothers worry. Ilham Nasser's son suffers from a skin disease. She says vaccines against polio, medicine, and proper sanitation are needed. She wonders how long it will take for them to get help and warns that children could die or become paralyzed.
We need a vaccine for it. We need medicine. We need proper sanitation. We want you to save us before it's too late. Or how long are we supposed to wait? Should we wait until we watch our children die and become paralyzed and then become helpless to do anything for them?
In Israel, relatives of the hostages held by Hamas express cautious optimism about the prospects of a ceasefire and the release of their loved ones.
We learned from past experience that not to build the expectation too much because Then if it doesn't complete to a deal, the disappointment is so huge and you go down so far that it's very hard to rise up again. But we still try to stay optimistic and hope.
Even as the ceasefire negotiations mediated by the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt are set to reconvene in Cairo this week, Israeli military operations haven't ceased. On Sunday, Palestinian authorities reported at least 28 people were killed in overnight strikes across Gaza. The Israeli military said it killed 20 militants in attacks Saturday night into Sunday. On the eve of his expected meeting with Blinken, Benjamin Netanyahu led a weekly cabinet meeting Sunday in which he criticized Hamas's approach to the peace talks and reiterated his stance that, quote, strong military and diplomatic pressure are the way to secure the release of the Israeli hostages. Veronica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News.
Approximately an hour after Blinken landed in Tel Aviv, the southern part of the city was rocked by an explosion that turned out to be a failed terrorist attack. For more, I'm joined by Ricky Rosen in Tel Aviv.
The bomb which exploded on the streets of Tel Aviv only killed the terrorist who was carrying it, who police identified as a Palestinian from the West Bank city of Nablus, and it also moderately injured an Israeli man who was passing on an electric scooter. We know that it was intended as a suicide bombing because it was claimed by both Hamas and Islamic Jihad this morning. And they said that it was in retaliation for the Israeli military operations in Gaza and the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Iran. Israeli police said that it seems like the bomb went off at that time by mistake, fortunately before the suicide bomber could reach a more populated target, which the police think could have been a nearby synagogue. But the police have raised the alert level throughout the Tel Aviv area because of the threat of other suicide bomb attacks, especially at this sensitive time when Blinken is visiting and there are intensive negotiations for a ceasefire going on.
I'm glad you mentioned Blinken's visit. Is there any indication that this attack might derail the ongoing ceasefire talks or put more pressure on Israel to take a harder stance in those talks?
I think if the bomb had been if the suicide bomber had succeeded in getting to a target in which he would kill a larger number of Israelis and do more damage, there would have definitely been a reaction on the part of Israel to closing down the ceasefire talks and refusing to engage with Hamas after a renewed terror attack. Fortunately, the terrorist only killed himself, and so it's being seen as something that fortunately did not achieve its aim and will probably be overlooked, except for the fact that there is an increased alert level, especially in the Tel Aviv area.
VOA's Ricky Rosen in Tel Aviv. Ricky, thanks for your time. Thanks for your reporting.
Thank you.
Moscow said Monday Ukraine had struck and damaged a third bridge in an assault on Russia's Kursk region. Ukraine says it has seized over 80 settlements in the area since its surprise incursion on Russian territory on August 6th as it continues its defensive efforts. Ukrainian military officials say their air defense units near Kyiv repelled a Russian air attack early Monday following Sunday's ballistic missile strikes in Kyiv. Lucy Fielder with Reuters has this update.
Russia carried out its third ballistic missile attack on Kyiv this month, but most of them are apparently shot down on approach, the city's military administration said on Sunday. Residents in the Ukrainian capital were inspecting the crater caused by what's believed to be a North Korean missile. Kyiv officials said there were no immediate reports of casualties in the capital. Russia and Ukraine accuse each other of striking civilian infrastructure in the war, and both deny doing so. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Saturday his troops had strengthened positions in Russia's Kursk region, nearly 2 weeks into their incursion. He called for bold decisions by Kyiv's allies to allow long-range strikes. These Ukrainian soldiers are conducting drills across the border from Kursk, where Ukraine says it has seized more than 80 settlements over 444 square miles. It's the biggest invasion of Russia since World War II. Against the backdrop of that incursion, Belarus's president, a staunch ally of Russia's Vladimir Putin, spoke of a tense standoff along his country's border with Ukraine on Sunday. President Alexander Lukashenko said Ukraine had stationed more than 120,000 troops along that border, and Minsk had deployed nearly a third of its armed forces there. Russia denied a report that Ukraine's Kursk attack had derailed indirect talks with Kyiv on halting strikes on energy and power targets. A spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry denied those talks had been going on, saying no one broke anything off because there was nothing to break off. She was responding to a report in the Washington Post on Saturday that Ukraine and Russia were planning to send delegations to Qatar this month to negotiate a landmark agreement on halting strikes on critical civilian infrastructure.
That was Lucy Fielders with Reuters. And now for more on the ground, we are joined by Anna Chernikova in Kyiv.
Kyiv and Kyiv region was under missile attack and drone attack over the weekend. The ballistic missile attack was actually a quite tough one. The city of Kyiv was protected, but according to Ukrainian officials, Ukrainian air forces, missiles were destroyed in the outskirts of Kyiv. But there were a number of damage in the Kyiv region and even some casualties. At this point, there is confirmation about damage of the private houses and casualties within the residents of the Kyiv region.
And I understand the government is ordering urgent and massive evacuations in the Pokrovsk region. What's the update there?
So Pokrov's direction in the Donetsk region is currently the toughest point at the Ukrainian front line on the territory of Ukraine. And General Syrskyi, who is reporting every day to President Zelensky and to the public about this, he's saying that situation is getting worse and situation is getting tougher for Ukrainian forces to keep the defense line. So Russian forces have advanced there, have success there. And according to local authorities, residents of Pokrovsk have no more than 2 weeks to evacuate. According to the reports, in 2 weeks, Russian forces might be getting control over the city of Pokrovsk if nothing changes and if the pace of the assault remain on the same level. Because also some experts predict that it might be that Russian forces will need to get people out from that area to protect Kursk region. But at this point, Ukrainian military reports that they don't see any changes and they don't see any withdrawal of the forces.
Anna Chernikova coming to us from Kyiv. We thank you so much for the update.
Thank you, Laurie.
Turning our attention now to American domestic politics. Thousands of Democratic Party delegates will celebrate Vice President Kamala Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as their presidential ticket for 2024 as they're gathering in Chicago for the National Democratic Convention. VOA's senior Washington correspondent Carolyn Prosciutti takes a look at some volatile confrontations from past conventions and how support for the party's candidate has grown since President Joe Biden dropped out of the race.
Chicago, 1968. Violence outside the Democratic National Convention between police and Vietnam War protesters. TV, still a relatively new medium, showing the conflicts live. New York City, 1976. The last time the Democratic Party would announce its vice presidential candidate at the convention, with presidential candidate Jimmy Carter choosing Walter Mondale.
We have that vision, we love our country, and we're going to do our job. Thank you very much.
Chaos at the next convention in 1980, when Senator Ted Kennedy challenged President Carter's re-election. Kennedy would concede to Carter in a famous speech that ended with this line.
The cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
Back to Chicago, 1996, and civil rights protesters demanding racial equality and welfare reform. Police keeping the crowds from entering the security perimeter. Denver, 2008. Barack Obama's acceptance speech moved to an outdoor stadium to accommodate the convention record crowd of 84,000.
With profound gratitude and great humility, I accept your nomination for presidency of the United States.
This week in Chicago, Vice President Kamala Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz begin their party's convention with some momentum. Last month, President Joe Biden was trailing Republican candidate Donald Trump in political polls. Since Biden dropped out, candidate Harris has risen in those polls. Last week's Morning Consult survey showing her 3 points ahead of Trump, although it remains a tight race. There will be protesters, as there always are at conventions, like these from last month's Republican gathering held in neighboring Wisconsin. Meeting them in Chicago will be thousands of federal, state, and local police officers. Derek Mayer is the U.S. Secret Service Deputy Special Agent in charge for the Democratic Convention.
I'm confident that our plan will provide a safe and secure environment during the DNC.
Chicago officials expect as many as 50,000 out-of-town visitors for the convention, with the city's United Center hosting the Democratic Party events. Carolyn Persutti, VOA News.
Along with the delegates, protesters and demonstrators of all types have gone to Chicago. Perhaps most visible and most politically consequential in this election are those protesting America's support for Israel in its war against Hamas. Andy Thayer is among them.
Any rights activist, I don't care what field you are in, if you're not in solidarity with people of Gaza and Palestine right now while a genocide is going on, then you are totally bankrupt as a rights activist. You cannot be in favor of your own liberation if you're not in favor of other people's liberation.
The convention will draw an estimated 50,000 people into Chicago, the nation's third largest city. And the city has said it's made necessary preparations with police and the Secret Service. Security will be tight with street closures around the convention center. You're listening to Flashpoint from the Voice of America. I'm Steve Karish in Washington. We'll be taking a look at Mpox in Nigeria a little later in the show.
But first, China's Coast Guard accused the Philippines of deliberately crashing one of its ships into a Chinese vessel early Monday near Sabina Shoal, a new flashpoint in the increasingly alarming territorial disputes between the countries in the South China Sea. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said the move seriously infringes on China's sovereignty. The Philippines disputed Beijing's account. It said 2 of its Coast Guard vessels encountered unlawful and aggressive maneuvers from Chinese vessels while on their way to supply Filipino personnel stationed in 2 occupied islands. Beijing claims almost all of the South China Sea, despite a 2016 ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague that Beijing's expansive claims had no basis under international law. Peace talks to end the 16-month war between Sudan's military and rival paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, got underway on Monday in Switzerland. While Sudanese military officials did not attend, U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan, speaking on the sidelines, struck a positive note.
It would be easier to work on the national cessation of hostilities if the Army sent a delegation, but we're going to continue to look for both unilateral steps from the parties as well as agreements operationalizing what we've seen. The key, though, is the results. It's not an announcement on paper. It's whether food and medicine is getting to the people who need it most, whether we're able to get commitments on civilian protection, vacating of hospitals, schools, and homes. And we will continue to engage with both parties in whatever way we can that produces results for the Sudanese people.
The U.S.-led talks aim to end the devastating war that broke out in April 2023 and to address the crippling humanitarian crisis that has left half of Sudan's population of 50 million facing food insecurity. And that isn't the only crisis facing the people of Sudan. The World Health Organization is also reporting an outbreak of cholera. Arthi Tayaparan with Reuters brings us this report.
The bacterial disease has killed more than 300 people in the region, according to WHO spokesperson Margaret Harris.
The reporting is slow, so we expect that there is more than that, but that's what we've had reported. We are seeing reports of cholera, measles, malaria, dengue, meningitis from several states.
Harris added that the conflict has hampered access to health care.
And we're seeing many attacks on health care. There's a shortage of medicines and medical supplies, shortage of health personnel, and also shortage of cash. Health workers are not being paid.
Global monitors say more than 6 million people are facing food insecurity in Sudan's Darfur region, and that famine has taken hold in North Darfur's Zamzam camp. The World Food Programme's Lenny Kinsley says more than half of the country, or 25 million people, are facing acute hunger.
Of those, around 755,000 people are in the highest stage of food insecurity, catastrophic hunger, which basically means they've run out of all options and are surviving in whatever way they can, eating leaves off trees, eating grass. It is the world's largest hunger crisis.
On Thursday, Sudan's Sovereign Council said it would allow the use of the outbreak border crossing with Chad for 3 months. Agencies have been waiting for that to happen, to get aid into parts of Darfur that are threatened with famine. Darfur is mostly controlled by the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, the army's rival in a 16-month-long war. The army-aligned government had blocked aid deliveries through that crossing in February into territory controlled by the RSF, alleging it was being used for the delivery of weapons.
That was Arthi Tayaparan with Reuters reporting.
Meanwhile, Nigeria is on high alert as health officials there announced more cases of Mpox. This follows last week's Mpox Global Health Emergency declaration by the World Health Organization, and there are real concerns about the country's ability to contain the outbreak, especially given its already strained healthcare system. VOA's Steve Miller narrates this report by Gibson Emeka in Abuja.
The Nigeria Center for Disease Control, or NCDC, says it has recorded 39 cases of Mpox so far this year. It's amid a surge in infections across Africa. Although no deaths have been recorded in Nigeria, the emergence of a more virulent strain of the virus is alarming. Bayelsa, Cross River, Ogun, and Lagos states are currently the most affected by the outbreak. Speaking at a news conference, NCDC lead Dr. Elijah D. Idris said that the nation is ramping up its response.
Noting the significant concern of the ease of cross-border transmission, this press conference is part of the efforts to intensify our coordination and communication with stakeholders to manage the spread of the virus and prevent disease importation.
Mpox is a rare viral zoonotic disease, meaning it's primarily an animal disease that can be transmitted to humans. The disease is endemic in several African countries, with over 2,800 cases reported across 13 countries this year, claiming more than 500 lives. With a more lethal strain emerging, Idris noted that vaccination plans are being considered for high-risk populations.
The Nigerian government is making efforts to make vaccines available to the public, especially for the hotspot areas.
Despite the NCDC's response protocols, public concern remains high regarding Nigeria's overstretched healthcare system. Symptoms of Mpox include fever, body aches, weakness, headaches, and rashes. As Nigeria works to secure vaccines and educate the public health experts like Idris and the NCDC urge citizens to adhere to preventative measures, such as avoiding contact with potentially infected animals and practicing good hygiene to mitigate the risk of further spread. For Gibson Emeka, I'm Steve Miller, VOA News.
And that ends today's program, but there is more VOA coverage 24 hours a day on our website, voanews.com, and across our social media platforms. On behalf of Steve Karish and all of us here at VOA, thank you so much for listening. Until tomorrow, I'm Lori London.
For deeper dives and expert analysis, listen to VOA Podcasts. Issues in the News explores the biggest stories every weekend, while International Edition keeps you informed every weekday. Plus, with the 5-minute newscast at the top of every hour, you're always up to date.